Hello, this is just a test. I wanted to do a sound check really quick, see if this is working. If so, would somebody be able to type in the live chat box if you can hear me? Thanks, Tyler. I'm going to try this again, and would you let me know if I need to do something on my end? I could try restarting my sound. Check 1, 2, 3. Check 1, 2, 3. Check 1, 2, 3. Check 1, 2, 3. Okay, great. Thanks, Phyllis, and thanks for moderating today. I'll just start speaking right now, not beginning the presentation, but maybe if you can see my screen, my only concern is my stream status is poor. When I tried it last night and this morning, it was between good and excellent. I've gone through my house and asked different people to turn off their Wi-Fi, so I hope it kind of changes now. It's back to good, so hopefully this works. Phyllis, if you can still hear me, I just sent you a message on the messenger asking if you think everything is going all right from your end as a moderator. Phyllis, can you describe by indistinct, is that I assume that's the sound? Test 1, 2, 3. Test 1, 2, 3. Test 1, 2, 3. If you guys could let me know if my sound is any better. Thanks for the feedback, Phyllis. Let me try just speaking a little bit louder and adjusting my mouthpiece. And I tested this last night. It's awfully loud whenever I touch the mouthpiece, but hopefully that sounds a little bit better. And I would talk normally louder than this. And sorry, I'm not trying to wake any babies. There's no babies here to wake up right now. So thanks for letting me know about that feedback, though. Again, just let me know if this sounds any better. I'm not sure why I was talking in a quieter voice. Speak louder than you need to. Okay, let's adjust this just a tad. All right, Phyllis, you're right. I was kind of whispering. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's kind of intimidating in front of the internet here live, but would you let me know if you can hear me speaking better now? Perfect. Thank you. Thanks, Grace. It's good to see you're here as well. Thanks for joining and being a moderator. I appreciate both of your help with this. Again, I'm going to keep adjusting my mouthpiece. I have a time of 10:54, so we'll probably get started here just after 5 minutes or so. I try to look at the other live review streams, and it looked like people would check in a little bit earlier just to make sure things are going. I'm glad we did it this time as well. I have to say it's a little bit odd because I feel like I'm sitting here talking to myself, but I guess I better get used to it. Again, thanks for all the feedback. I'm not sure where you are at, and my moderators, I apologize. I just put your names on the slide to thank you for being moderators. I noticed some other people had also put the high school and where you teach at, and I just didn't get around to that. But wherever you are, I can tell you today is a beautiful sunny day here in southwest Colorado, and it's hard to be inside right now, but hopefully get out this afternoon. Thanks, Grace. Thanks, Phyllis. Stay warm. I do have a quick question. It looks like when I go to present for my Google slide, I will no longer be able to see the live chat off to the right. So I'm going to keep my Google, let's try that again, Facebook Messenger on, and maybe Phyllis or Grace, if there are any issues in the middle of the presentation, maybe if it gets cut off for any reason and I'm not aware of that and I just keep going, if you would let me know, I appreciate it. But hopefully we don't have anything like that come up. right, we'll get started here in just a couple of minutes. Gonna change the settings on my phone so it doesn't go to sleep so quickly. Dim it down. Okay. Messenger. Alright, plug this in over here. Alright, I'm going to pull away from where I can see the live chat soon and get going with the presentation. Welcome, Clifford. It's good to see you. Thanks for being a moderator today. Appreciate your help. And I was just saying, maybe it's my lack of technology expertise, but it seems like when I go to full screen on here, I may not be able to see the live chat comments while I'm doing this. There's probably a way, I'm just not sure of that. So if something does come up, I'm keeping my Facebook Messenger open, and just let me know. Let's make our way to the next screen. Right here. And hit present. Okay, we'll get going here shortly. And I have 11 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get going with this. This is going to be the 2020 AP Biology Live exam review for Unit 8 Ecology. My name is Ryan Waite. I teach at Fruita Monument High School here in Fruita, Colorado. And first thing I want to do is give a special thanks to our moderators today. I have Grace Wheeler, Clifford Nefrata, and Phyllis Robinson. Thank you guys for doing that. Linked below this video, you'll find a slideshow for this presentation. I've also included a couple other things like the CED exam, course and exam description. I should also mention now that the host and moderators and other people in this group have talked about doing another session next Saturday. That's a question and answer session. So if you get the chance to log on then, that would be excellent as well. This video, this is Unit 8, and as you probably know, Unit 8 is not included on this year's AP Biology exam. Neither is Unit 7, Natural Selection. That doesn't mean, though, that I don't still think this is important, therefore I'm going to still do this. I think it's a good introduction if you have not had the chance to look at that in your class, and I think it's a good review if you did get a look at it. Also, I think it's really important to identify the connections between the other units. We'll see lots of connections between units 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and 6, and I'll try to highlight those when we get there. But it's really important that we talk about the concepts and the scientific practices that you could still see on this year's AP Bio exam, which I wish all my students luck for that, by the way. All right. Good, I am looking at my messages. Let's keep going with this one. So I wanted to start out by telling you a story. When I was in college, I had a lot of interesting jobs, but probably my favorite job was when I was a wildland firefighter in Mesa Verde, Colorado National Park. And while we were firefighting, we trained for many hours to dig fire line, which is just moving all the shrubs and trees. So it's like a 3 to 5 foot long line around the perimeter of the fire. And the idea was to take away any fuel that fire could possibly use. One day, we had the park biologist come out and showed us this plant. This is a Mesa Verde wandering elite, and I'm sorry it's a black and white picture on here. It only stands about 10 to 12 centimeters tall. It has green leaves and a yellow flower at the very end. And the reason the park biologist wanted to show us this was because it's a very unique plant. It's found only on Mesa Verde, the plateau, and mostly within the park. So it's an endemic species. An endemic species is a plant or animal that exists only in one specific geographic region. So this Mesa Verde wandering allele is also unique in that it has a relationship with this butterfly. This is the black swallowtail butterfly. And the butterfly's larvae use this plant to get food. They feed on it. And so this rare plant, if it were to disappear, it could also lead possibly to the disappearance of this butterfly as well. So we ask questions like, what environmental factors limit the geographical distribution of the Mesa Verde wandering elite? Or what other species does it interact with? Questions like these are the subject of ecology. Ecology is the scientific study of organisms and the environment, which we're going to look at today. The different branches that I want to begin looking at, these are according to the course exam and description of the AP Biology College Board exam. We're going to start by looking at the responses. The responses of other organisms. How do other organisms respond to the environment? Is it a behavior change? Let me see, excuse me. Get this off here, sorry about that. Is it a behavior change? What are their communication mechanisms? And man, I'm having troubles. Let's see if this goes away. Delete from computer. I apologize for that. Let's see if this can keep going. So try this again. The responses. How do organisms respond to the environment? Is it a behavior change? What are their communication mechanisms? And how does this increase their chance of survival? Next thing is we'll look at energy. How does energy flow through an ecosystem? How do organisms obtain and use this energy? And how could these changes affect the ecosystem? We'll also look at population ecology. The two factors we'll look at there is population size and population density. We'll then look at community ecology, which is we're going to look at how the interactions between species affect a community structure and its organization. Next, we'll look at biodiversity, and we're going to look closely at the relationship between the diversity of an ecosystem and how that responds to its resistance and change. We'll also talk about keystone species at that time. And finally, we're going to look at disruptions. These disruptions could include genetic changes in populations, invasive species, human activities, or geological or meteorological events. So the first thing we're going to look at is responses to environment. How does an organism's response relate to its changes in its internal or external environment? So we're going to consider both its behavior and this information exchange. So we're going to look at this control system. All organisms need to detect and respond to changes in their internal and external environment. This is because conditions inside our body must be carefully controlled for it to function effectively and be able to survive. The control systems that allow organisms to respond to change are incredibly important to survival. So the unit here that this really connects to is Unit 4 in cell communication. We no longer have the nervous system on the exam directly, but I still think it plays some really important importance as far as examples. So all control systems we're going to look at here, they must include cells, which are receptors, which are then going to detect a stimulus. A stimulus is a change in the environment. The stimulus might include a change in light, change in temperature, change in odor, or a change in sound. That is then going to be transferred over here to the control center. The control center could be the brain, a spinal cord, or another organ which is going to receive and process this information and then send it to the receptors. Finally, it's going to go out here through another nerve and it's going to end at the effectors. The effectors bring about response or they restore normal levels. Examples include body temperature and glucose levels. Effectors could include muscles or glands. The next one we're looking at for responses is how does an organism's response affect its fitness? Now, this is kind of interesting. Responses of organisms affect their overall fitness and possibly the success of the population. So the first thing I want to talk about are signals. And this picture right here, the top snake, is a picture I took about 3 weeks ago when I was on a hike with my son here in Southwest Colorado. My 8-year-old son was in front of me, and he was bending down looking at something, pointing at something. And as I got closer, I heard a faint rattling sound, so I was a little bit on nerves. When he pointed at something and I saw some snake-like creature move about 10 feet away, I grabbed him and I ran another 10 feet. I was able to look back on it, though, and get a closer look. And what this is a great basin gopher snake, commonly referred to as a bull snake. It's really cool because one thing I wasn't aware until I researched later, it has an organ in its mouth called a glottis, which opens and closes quickly and resembles the rattle of a rattlesnake. It can do a few other things too, like shake its tail, and even though it doesn't have a rattle, it still mimics that the rattlesnake, and it can make its head flat like a viper. So it does all of these things in response to a potential predator, and what it's trying to do is just increase its fitness to stay alive and reproduce. This is another example of this down here. Animals also use audible, visual, tactile, and electrical and chemical signals to indicate dominance, find food, establish territory, and ensure reproductive success. So in this picture down here, we have a lion using a chemical marker in its urine to warn other lions of its territorial boundaries. Innate and learned behaviors are also important in this as well. Responses to information and communication of information are vital to natural selection. So these innate and learned behaviors, first of all, if you're not sure, innate means it's pre-wired, it's programmed. The organism knows how to do that without having to be taught, versus learned is obviously something like a mother bear teaching its young how to go fishing or how to fish differently than other bears so it's more successful. If we continue going down here, we're going to look at cooperative behaviors next. Cooperative behavior tends to increase the fitness of the individual and the survival of the population. So the example I wanted to talk about here are marmots. Marmots are a very vocal animal. They have a variety of distinct types of calls, including chirps, whistles, growls, and whining sounds. Many of these calls are used as alarms, alerting other marmots in the population to the presence of potential predators. And again, the whole idea is to increase its fitness to survive and reproduce. Next thing, I've inserted in here some questions. I know it might be kind of odd, but I thought to make it a little bit more interactive, it might be fun to have a question kind of at the end of each subtopic. So question number 1 asks you, which of the following statements incorrectly describes how communication among individuals within a population may increase the long-term success of the population? I'll let you read over these choices, A, B, C, or D, and then we'll talk about them. We'll do an awkward pause here for just a little bit. All right. I think the key thing here was to identify that we're looking for the incorrect statement on this one. If you identified A, you are correct. Innate behaviors may increase survival in an organism. That's true. While learned behaviors generally do not improve survival outcomes. That second part is not true. Both innate and learned behaviors support that. The next subtopic, we're looking at energy flowing through ecosystems, and we're asking, how do organisms use and acquire energy? So organisms use energy to maintain organization, to grow, and reproduce. The first thing we're going to look at here are the difference between endotherms and ectotherms, which I also remember discussing in another unit. Endotherms use energy generated by metabolism to maintain homeostatic temperature, like you and I, humans, versus ectotherms lack this mechanism for maintaining body temperature, but they can still adjust their temperatures by moving to the location, whether in the sun or in the shade, or bunching up with another group of individuals. So endotherms versus ectotherms. Another thing that we need to talk about is reproductive strategies. We have a K selection strategy, which is what the humans and whales would follow. They have very few offspring. This is an example by this one baby next to the whale. And it has long gestation, so it has a fairly long pregnancy, long parental care, and a long period until sexual maturity. That's in contrast to our selection, which is demonstrated down here in the mice. The mice, they have an R selection strategy where they have many offspring. They have a short gestation period, they have very little parental care, and a short time until sexual maturity. So again, that's a K selection versus R selection. Metabolic rate. This was really hard to find a picture of, so I want to just describe it to you. Generally, the smaller the organism, like the mouse, the higher the metabolic rate, versus the larger organism, like the whale, the lower the metabolic rate. And the last thing down here, we're supposed to look at net energy gain versus net energy loss. I'm just getting a little bit of feedback right now saying the microphone is getting a little bit of echo feedback. So let me play with it here just a little bit. I apologize for any sounds. All right, check 1, 2, 3. Check 1, 2, 3. And Phyllis, if you wouldn't mind letting me know if that sounds any better. If not, I'll adjust it here after our next question. Let's keep going with this. Net energy gain versus net energy loss. The big idea here is making sure that the organism has more energy going into it than it does leaving it. Ultimately, if more energy is going to result in storage and growth of an organism, but if you lose energy, that's going to result in loss of mass and ultimately death of the organism. Let's keep going. And moderators, if there's anything, okay, good. Sounds like the sound has improved. Thanks for letting me know. Let's keep going with energy. And the next question is, how do changes in energy affect populations? Changes in energy availability result in changes in population size, and they can disrupt ecosystems. So in this one, I wanted to look at a change in the energy source. This is a picture from California's Santa Monica Mountains. Can you tell, just by looking at this picture, which slope is north-facing and which slope is south-facing? I'll give you just a minute. And I'll adjust my mic. Okay, we'll see if that helps. Again, keep giving me feedback on the sound. I appreciate it. But if you look closely right here, the slope on the left side is the north-facing slope. It has more moisture versus the slope over here on the right side is the south-facing slope, and it's much more dry. It receives more direct sunlight, so it's sparsely vegetated and has more of a drought-tolerant type of shrub to it. Now, the next thing down here is when we talk about change in the producer level. The biggest example I could think, or the best example, would be think of this energy pyramid as a game of Jenga. Right now, it says there's 100% primary producers. If we cut that out and turn it into 50%, then this leaning tower or leaning pyramid would be on top of there. And that just wouldn't support all the other trophic levels above it. So if you change the primary producer level, that's going to result in a drastic change for all the other levels above that. The next question we want to ask is, how do autotrophs and heterotrophs affect the flow of energy through an ecosystem? Autotrophs capture energy from physical or chemical sources. So let's look at that really quickly. Hopefully you got to watch the review session on cellular energy and should have reviewed photosynthesis. And the idea of photosynthesis is we're using energy. They capture energy in the form of sunlight to turn that into some type of sugar. So we're going from some type of sunlight energy to chemical energy. Versus if we're looking at something that's chemosynthesis, like the hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the ocean, that's where we're using organisms can capture energy from small inorganic molecules found in the environment. Oftentimes this is where the sun doesn't reach or there is no oxygen. Finally, let's look at heterotrophs. Heterotrophs capture energy found in carbon-containing compounds. So usually, again, don't forget that systems like this, photosynthesis and cellular respiration, are coupled, and a lot of times the sugars or the energy that's produced here will be used to drive this process as well. Heterotrophs may metabolize carbohydrates, which is common in almost all the examples that I see in the book. Glycolysis is the first step, and so we think, oh, it must be carbs that get broken down, but it's also important to remember that lipids are broken down, proteins are also broken down as well, in case there's a change in diet of the organism. The next thing we're going to look at, this is another question. It says, in the chart below, compares the annual energy expenditure for various functions of several animals. According to the data, a 4-kilogram male Adelie penguin has a higher energy expenditure than a similar-sized eastern indigo snake. So we see that they both have the same mass, 4 kilograms, but what's different here is their energy expenditure. I'll give you just a minute to look over your answer choices. And the correct one here would be C, mode of internal temperature regulation. Remember that the penguin would be an endotherm and the snake would be an ectotherm. All right, moving on to the next sessions, or this next sections. There's 8.3 and 8.4 I've combined into population ecology. And the question asks, what factors influence the size and density of a population? It tells us that interactions with other organisms and the environment are really what's going to influence this. So I wanted to introduce two important terms right now. Those are the dependent limiting factors, density-dependent limiting factors, which are things like competition, predation, parasitism, and disease, versus the density-independent limiting factors. These could be things like natural disaster, unusual weather. It doesn't depend on your size or your density. These will affect populations of all densities equally or fairly equally. So let's move to the next one. What factors influence the size and density of a population? We're looking at population growth dynamics here. Populations are made of organisms that interact with one another and with the environment in complex ways. I know that this is still kind of interesting. I think it's really important to just quickly review these equations. We're not going to do a whole lot with this, but if nothing else, I want to point out to you, it is found on your equation and formula sheet. And here's the important things. When I taught AP Physics a few years ago, all my students had to memorize every formula and every equation and all the variables. So one of the things I really like about AP Biology is that they give this to you. I hope that all students going into the exam have the formula and equation sheet in front of them. And this particular one is looking at population growth. And you can see the variables are dn over dt. A lot of times my students get confused about that. Anytime we have something over t, that is time, that's rate, and that's really what we're solving for. So to solve for that, we would take the birth rate minus the death rate. And if you get a positive number, then the population's growing. If you get a negative number, then obviously it's not. What factors influence the size and density of a population? Reproduction without constraints results in exponential growth. So the first one we were just looking at general growth. Now we're looking at specifically exponential growth. Again, you'll see we're solving for rate over here. R max is going to be the maximum per capita growth rate, and N is the population size. So if you were asked to do a math problem like this, hopefully you could just identify what these variables are, substitute them in here, and get your answer. Let's talk a little bit about what that would look like. In Colorado, some professors at the University of Colorado have developed this simulation that I really enjoy with all my classes. It's the PhET. And basically, this is one of their simulations. It's under natural selection, but it really applies to types of growth right now. And what they've done in this particular one is there's a bunch of rabbits, and they've made it so that there are no predators. They've taken the predators away, they've taken some other limiting factors away, and what we see with very little constraints, what would happen with these rabbits, the population growth would just explode. So this would result in an exponential growth. It has this very typical J-shaped curve. One of my favorite things about the simulation, what it will do is it will show you this is a planet that's been overpopulated by rabbits, because when rabbits reproduce, they reproduce like rabbits. So let's look at the next one. How is population density affected by resource availability? So now we're getting some things that are going to limit that growth. Population density can exceed the resources available. In fact, this is what usually happens at some point. And this is going to be called our logistic growth. What causes this? Both density dependent and density independent factors lead to this type of logistic growth. Let's just quickly look at the equation in case you were asked to look at a similar equation on the AP exam. Again, identify what the R max is. N, it tells you down here, population size, and then you've got your K and N. I think this is just a good reminder to make sure you do your math inside the parentheses first before you go ahead and solve for this. So in the same simulation, and I'm sorry this is a little bit blurry of a screenshot, what this would look like, if you can see, I know it's hard, but I've added in some wolves in here. And when the wolves are added, the rabbits still reproduce, but it's not as quickly. In fact, they get to a certain point we're going to call the carrying capacity, and they kind of hover, the population hovers around this point for a little while. It might go up and down a little bit, but it's going to hover around right here, which is, again, our carrying capacity. I debated whether I should put this type of a problem in or not. This is a math question, and really it's from an older test, but I still think it's good to get some practice with the equations. So it says up here, a population of fire ants exhibits logistic growth pattern. The carrying, that's going to be important. We know we're going to use the logistic growth equation. So let me put that down here. The carrying capacity of the ant mound is 15,000 ants. The maximum per capita growth rate, R max, is 0.9 fire ants per month. Calculate the maximum population growth rate for this population if the maximum growth occurs when n equals k divided by 15. Give your answer to the nearest whole number. So this is kind of a complicated problem, and let's just walk through it really quickly. I want to make sure I identify my R max down here at 0.9. Again, I know I'm going to be using the logistic growth equation, and I've got my carrying capacity, K, right here at 15,000. Now, to get N, the population size, it tells me right here, I need to take the K and divide it by 15. When I do that, I find that 15,000 divided by 15 gives me 1,000. I can then plug it into the rest of my equation. I have my R max, my N, and now we get K. It's going to look something like this. Just a quick reminder, you always want to do your math inside the parentheses first. You'd subtract those two and then multiply. All right, moving on to community ecology. And let's see, I'm going a little bit fast here. We're doing good. All right. Get this up. The first question I ask you says, how is the structure of a community measured and described in terms of species composition and diversity? So the first thing I want to talk about is species composition. This is actually a picture taken from the monument near Fruita, Colorado. That's what the city is right here, and our high school is located just about right here. And when we look at species composition, I want to focus on the green that we see. This is commonly called PJ, or pinyon juniper woodland. And so it's made of pinyon pine trees mixed with Utah juniper trees. So we know the two trees that exist here. Obviously there's a little bit of sagebrush mixed in as well. But then when we talk about species diversity asks how much total is there? So how many, if we did a total count of all the trees, how many specifically are pinyon pine? This is another equation I'm not going to go into too much detail on, but it's the Simpson's Diversity Index. And it looks like it could be scary, but it's really not bad. And again, they tell you what the variables are. N is your total number of organisms of a specific species, and capital N is going to be the total number of organisms of all the species. If you're able to find that, square that value. If you had more than one value, this is the summation sign. You'd add all those together and take 1 minus your value right there. And if we keep looking at community ecology, the next question we're going to explore is, how do interactions within and between populations influence community structure? The first thing we need to recognize is that communities change over time. Access to energy and matter are extremely important. Interactions can be modeled. They can be modeled with negative and positive signs, and that's what I have over here. So if we look at competition, the interaction, this is supposed to be one species, species X, here's species Y, and here's an example over here. It says if competition, when two things are competing, it's going to be a negative effect on species X and a negative effect on species Y. So lions and cheetahs living in same or similar territories are going to find themselves in competition with one another, and it's both kind of a small detrimental effect, or could be large. The next one is predation and parasitism. And we're going to choose one of those species. Obviously, the host is going to be the negative, the host to a parasite, or if it's the prey, it's going to have a negative effect on this, and the consumer is going to have the positive effect. Example of this would be a praying mantis eating a bumblebee. The praying mantis will get the positive effect of more energy, and the bumblebee loses, so we give it a negative score. Mutualism, we have both have a positive effect on both species. An example here would be a pollinator. A pollinator is going to be able to receive pollen and nutrients it needs, versus the flower also benefits because it's going to then allow its pollen to be carried away by the pollinator so that it can spread and reproduce as well. The last one is commensalism, and this is what I've experienced is always a hard example to find, but this is where one species is benefited and the other is not negatively harmed nor benefited, so we just kind of call it neutral. An example of this is the only one of the better examples I could find would be a tiger and a jackal, where the jackals, they feed off of the tiger's leftovers from what they haven't finished, and the tiger, as long as it's fed, it's really not affected by the jackal that much. So that's just a good example of commensalism. We get to another one up here, and it's asking us, how is community structure related to energy availability? So I wanted to talk about this one a little bit with another personal example. It's good to recognize that cooperation or coordination between organisms, populations, and species results in either enhanced movement of or access to matter and energy. So it's important to recognize that communities change over time depending on the interactions between populations. Interactions among populations determine how they access energy and matter within a community. And so this is one of the ones that I wanted to talk about really quickly. This is a pinyon jay, which we find here in our area, and this is a pinyon pine. Now it's interesting because the pinyon jay will feed off of the pine nuts produced by the pinyon tree, and it can hold up to 50 pinyon nuts in its mouth. It's going to take those nuts and it's going to build a hole and store those. It's going to bury them, and it just is going to do this all over this territory. The pinyon pine knows what they're going to do is produce a bumper crop. About every 7 years, every tree in the area will produce an abundant number of pine nuts so that the birds don't specifically choose against one pine tree. Now, the cool thing about this is what's benefited here. Obviously, the pinyon jay is going to
receive energy because it's going to receive food from this. Now, all these storages or caches, these underground burials that it keeps its food in, it's kind of funny. They've analyzed this and they think it remembers about 95% of all these burial spots where it puts these pinion nuts. So that's a benefit for it. It can go back throughout the year, dig up the nuts, and receive that energy. The tree is also benefited because about 5% of the time, the pinyon jay forgets where the cache is, and it helps the pinyon tree in that the pinyon nuts are planted. They receive water when there's precipitation, and that allows the trees to grow and spread. They have access to matter and energy then. All right, let's see. Here's another question. I'll read it for you, then let you analyze it. It says, interdependence in nature is illustrated by the transfer of energy through trophic levels. The diagram below depicts the transfer of energy in a food web of a lake located in Alaska. If the cells in the dead terrestrial plant material that washed into the lake contained a commercially produced toxin, what would be the likely effect of this toxin on the food web? Take a look at that, and then take a look at your answer choices. All right, if you guessed A on this one, you are correct. Toxins pose a greater risk to the lake trout than to larvae or snails because the lake trout is a top-level predator. This is kind of the same reason. This is a biological magnification. It's the same reason they encourage pregnant women not to eat shark, because things like mercury can build up. If it's just consumed in a few small animals, the animals that feed on those will have an even higher concentration, and then the animals that eat those will have an even higher concentration than that. All right, second to last one, let's look at biodiversity. And the question is, how does diversity in an ecosystem relate to its resilience to change? In ecology, resilience is defined as the capacity of an ecosystem to respond to a disturbance by resisting damage and recovering quickly. Examples of disturbances can include things like fires, floods, windstorms, insect population explosions, or even human activities. So over here I've put ecosystems with fewer parts and less diversity are often less resilient to changes in the environment. So if you think of it, you could think of an ecosystem with fewer parts has a smaller gene pool to pull from. So if there were a disaster of some type, they would be less likely to be able to fight that and to be able to recover from that. Now we should also mention keystone species down here. A keystone species is a species which has a disproportionately large effect on its environment relative to its abundance. So again, a keystone species isn't necessarily the species that's most abundant. It can be very rare, but it's going to have a huge impact on the environment around it. When we look at biodiversity, we should also ask, how does the addition or removal of a species affect the structure of an ecosystem? Species diversity influences the organization of the ecosystem, and if you remove a keystone species, it can cause the ecosystem to collapse. So, an example of this would be in the late 1700s, 1800s, sea otters of North America were along the west coast were hunted commercially for their fur, and their numbers were drastically reduced in the North Pacific Ocean, so much so that they were unable to control the urchin population. So the sea otters eat the urchins. The urchins, in return, feed on the this kelp forest. And what happened was, when the sea otters began disappearing, the urchins just exploded. And with that many urchins, they really began this drastic change in the ecosystem of killing the kelp forest. It was a very interesting process to watch, and it was interesting because they were able to reintroduce sea otters, and that enabled them to keep the ecosystem back to normal. It was able to restore the ecosystem to somewhat what its normal normal position was. All right, so here's another question for you. The graph below shows changes in the numbers of species in an aquatic ecosystem when the aquatic organism Pisaster is present versus when it's absent. Take a look at the graph, take a look at your answer choices, and we'll talk about that here in just a minute. All right, on this one, based on the data, Pisaster is most likely. If you guess D, keystone species, you are correct. And why is that so? Because with the keystone species, you can see that the number of species present remains fairly stable, if not increasing. But when we take out the keystone species, the ecosystem really tends to collapse. The number of species present almost disappears. Then for our last section, we're going to talk about disruptions to ecosystems. The first question we're going to ask is, what is the relationship between the environment and random variations in populations? First of all, we need to recognize that adaptations provide advantages. An adaptation is any genetic variation that's favored by selection and is shown in the form of a trait that gives an advantage to an organism in a specific environment. So in my class, we do a lot with HHMI, the Howard Heward Medical Institute, and what they show a lot of times are these pocket mice. The pocket mice are unique because this picture kind of shows there are two different substrates or ground coverings. On a light colored substrate over here, mice with dark color fur, mice with light color fur are camouflaged from predators. On a dark substrate over here, found on this side, a dark mouse like this one is better able to blend in and avoid predation. Predators can more easily spot mice with light color fur on a dark substrate. Mice that survive predation are more likely to live, reproduce, and pass on their favorable traits. Now, what's the difference between the light mice and the dark-colored fur mice? It all has to do with the mutation. And if you follow the activities, we learned that this is a mutation in the MC1R gene that's responsible for this dark color in the mice that gives the population of some of these mice a dark color, other mice a light color, and depending on the substrate, that's going to be an advantage. The other important thing to recognize in this activity is that there are two different colors of substrates or ground because there was volcanic activity that really turned this ground a darker color that allowed the darker color mice to survive on that versus the light color substrate. So kind of an interesting scenario to analyze. The next question we ask is, how do invasive species affect ecosystem dynamics? So I wanted to choose this one because this is another one that affects our area quite a bit. And first of all, invasive species exploit a new niche free of predators, competitors, and outcompete the organisms for resources. What this results is uncontrolled population growth and ecological changes. So this over here is tamarisk. It's also called salt cedar, and it's an invasive tree in the southwest United States, probably in quite a few places in the U.S. Like other invasive species, tamarisk is able to grow quickly and outcompete with native plants. It's adapted to grow in habitats where other plant species can't tolerate the poor soil conditions. It's been estimated that the tamarisk can spread up to 12 miles downstream per single year, and one tree can use as much as 20 gallons of water a day. So it's a very thirsty plant. People in our area, the dry southwest, I know they're always analyzing the structure, but for the longest time it had a really bad reputation because in the southwest, water is like gold. And so if you have a plant that's consuming this much water, that's a bad thing, but it's also drastically changing the ecosystem, which is another thing to consider. Well, one of the last things we're going to look at is how has human activities led to changes in ecosystems. Human impact accelerates changes at local and global levels. The introduction of a new disease can devastate native species, and habitat change can occur because of human activity. Let's talk about both of these really quickly. This is an example of Dutch elm disease. This is a fungal disease in elm trees. The fungus moves into the trees by way of 3 different types of beetles. These beetles usually go after the weaker trees, but they'll also go after the healthy trees that have an opening or wound in them as well. Because the tree, what they're going to do is start to eat from the branches outward, and because the tree can't send its nourishment through the phloem to the roots, they're eventually going to die, and eventually the tree is going to starve to death. The disease is, I didn't mean to hit that. The disease is believed to have thought to come from the Netherlands to North America in the early 1900s, where it wiped out millions of trees in the US and Canada because the native elm trees had no natural resistance. Since then, people have learned how to prevent the spread of the fungus, and they've developed more resistant strains of the American elm. Now, if we're talking about habitat change can occur because of human activity, this is such a broad topic too. There's lots of ways that this could happen. Changes like overpopulation could lead to drastic changes. Pollution, burning fossil fuels, deforestations. Changes like these have triggered climate change, soil erosion, poor air quality, and undrinkable water. Sometimes these negative effects also impact human behavior as well. It could lead to war for limited resources, or it could cause an entire population of humans to have to move out of their territory. And then one of the last things we're going to look at here, as far as disruptions to ecosystems, is the question of how has global activity led to changes in ecosystems? Geological and meteorological events affect habitat change and ecosystem distribution. When we're looking at this, we can mention the theory of continental drift and how that explains how continents that were once joined together in this giant landmass, Pangaea, they slowly started to drift apart due to plate tectonics. Evidence for this theory lies in the geological similarities between the edges of the continents. Fossil comparisons, which are highlighted here, we find this species both in South America and Africa, and these other species as well across here. And then the jigsaw puzzle shape. So these are all evidences for the theory of continental drift. On a geological timescale, the fossil record shows that there's always been a constant reshuffling of species and ecosystems throughout Earth's history. When the continents move on plates, they're changing the specific area's latitude, its location. They're going to have a different habitat. So we've been looking very microscopically until now. Now we stand back and look at the fossil record, and we see this has happened in the past. It's important to analyze our geological record, but it's also important to realize that humans can greatly accelerate this process of changing habitats and ecosystems, even though it's been a natural process in our world for many, many years. Biogeographical studies illustrate these changes. That's kind of what this is referring to as well. For one last multiple choice question, which there are no multiple choice questions on this year's exam, but I still think that the concepts are important. It says that Adelie penguins need ice as a platform to feed on krill, while chinstrap and gentoo penguins prefer to live in areas with less ice. Which of the following explanations is the least likely reason for these trends shown in the graph? All right, there's our enough time for an awkward pause. Hopefully you got to read through these. If you chose A, the numbers of Adelie penguins decreasing due to global climate change, you're correct. This one, if you look at the chart closely, you see that, again, I think the key thing here was that the Adelie penguins really rely on an ice platform. And if you look down here over time, you can see that the number of penguins remaining has decreased. Most likely that's due to the ice decreasing due to climate change and human activity as well. All right, the last thing I had on here was a quick FRQ, and I know we're looking at time. It's 11:46 right now. We have a few minutes left. If you'd like to, it's always important for FRQ practice since that's what we're looking at this year's exam. It says on the top, ecological succession describes the pattern of changes in communities over time. The graph below shows changes in plant diversity following the abandonment of agricultural field in a temperate biome. So take a look at this chart. Make sure you analyze the axes. The y-axis is the species diversity, and the x-axis is time. And then we have all of our different shrubs and trees over here. We might take just a few minutes to let you look over these and see what you come up with, and then I'll go over the answers with you. All right, I don't want to spend too much time, but hopefully you got to look at this a little bit. When it asks you to discuss the differences in plant diversity shown in the graph, there's our first action verb, is to discuss. So we're just looking at differences in plant diversity. When I look at the key, you could talk about there's more diversity in the ground flora and shrubs, or there's less diversity in the understory and canopy. You could also say the differences in the rate of change in diversity. There's a rapid change in the ground flora. That's what we see right here. Anytime you see a steep line and it's over time, that indicates that it's going to be accelerating quickly. Or you could say that there's a slow change. That's by this. You can see this is a much less steep angle right here. The slow change in understory or canopy. You could also say that there's differences in the rate to community stabilization. You could say that it's faster for the ground flora, or you could say it's slower for the understory and canopy. The next thing it asks you to do right here is to explain how the changes affect animal species composition between years 0 and 120. And anytime you're given an FRQ in AP Biology and they give you these numbers, you need to talk about between these numbers only, between 0 and 120. The readers really aren't concerned about 120 and above. So some possibilities that you could have talked about here, you could have said, let me find my spot really quickly, explain effect on animal species. You could have said that pioneer communities, those are the ones that are established first, of small herbivores, insects, and other small ground-dwelling animals, is what we expect. Or you could say that there's going to be a climax community that consists of insects, birds, and mammals, and is multi-layered. So it's just trying to get you to see what could be the effects of this multi-species environment right here. Letter B, identify 2 biotic and 2 abiotic factors and discuss. So let's start with that one. Again, the easiest way to get points on FRQs is just to do what they ask you. Identify 2 biotic and 2 abiotic factors. Those could be a lot of things. In fact, just as make sure if it's biotic, it's living or was once living. 2 abiotic, make sure that's not something living. So I don't have anything on my key, but we could talk about those quickly. Let's talk about the abiotic factors. Those could be things like soil, water, and other things. I'm sorry, I just got a notification here. It says, can you explain the second to last question again? Why not choice C? I'm sorry, let's go back and look at this really quickly. I assume that this one was the one. Oh, and hopefully Phyllis tell me if this is the right one. But I think I'm getting a question here saying, why was the choice not C? And I'm sorry to interrupt this and go back to this. And if I look at it, it says the populations of Adelie penguins are decreasing, which is true, due to habitat fragmentation. Here's what I find a lot in AP biology. I can narrow down the 4 choices to 2 pretty good choices, and A and C seem to be both pretty good choices here. When C, because it says it's due to decreasing habitat fragmentation, remember, habitat fragmentation is where we are taking a habitat, and it could be something like roads or fences, but we're really doing what this says, we're fragmenting it. And because the question up here really didn't mention anything about fragmentation, that's why I would lead towards answer A instead of C. I hope that helps a little bit. Again, these aren't perfectly designed questions, but it's always good to analyze them and say, what would you choose on this? So hopefully we can get back to here. We are talking about our biotic and abiotic factors. And then the next thing says discuss how each could influence the pattern of ecological succession. Hopefully you could say, well, we talked about in this presentation about sunlight, if the sunlight is an abiotic factor. And if there were little sunlight on a north-facing slope, that might mean that there's more moisture. I'm sorry, I'm still following this. Tell you what, I'll go back and look at that last question here in just a little bit. And Phyllis, I do see your answer. Thanks for letting me know. It does say which is least likely. Let's finish this one really quickly before we go back and look at that. So again, we were talking about abiotic factor sunlight. Remember, the south-facing slope receives that sun. That could make it receive less moisture, and you might expect to find fewer trees and shrubs growing there. And then, last one for this one. This is just mentioning examples of biotic factors, and we could look at competition, predation, or herbivory. And we could look at a bunch of other, we could also talk about disease, parasitism, seed dispersal, or even human impact. Examples of abiotic factors, besides the one that I mentioned, others could be climate, rainfall, light, wind, temperature, soil composition, fire, drought, altitude, or geographic location. And then let's look at part C here really quickly, and we'll go back to that last question. C says design a controlled experiment to determine how the diversity of plant species in a newly abandoned field would be affected by large herbivores. On this one right here, they're saying for your experimental design, this is true for any FRQ, and I think that's why it's important to look at this. Make sure you identify the dependent and independent variables. And tell us the dependent variable, what would be being measured, the independent variable, what is going to be manipulated or changed. That's good to know. It says identify the dependent variable and how it's measured. That's always important. So when you're talking about how it's, not only do you identify it, but you need to be specific about how you're identifying it. Are you counting the number of species? Not just saying, oh, species diversity in general. How would you count those? It says discuss variables to be held constant whenever you're asked to design an experiment on an FRQ. Make sure you say what's being held constant. It could, on this one it says at least 3 things are held constant. One can be divide the field in half so that you're keeping all things the same except one. Identify the controls. What things are you going to have as a control that you expect not to change? Verification and replication. What I tell my students on FRQs, if you say the simple words as repeat the experiment 3 times or have multiple trials, usually that's always an extra point in the FRQ as well. And then hypothesis or testable prediction. It never hurts to throw a hypothesis in there in the if-then format. So the question I had earlier was, A versus D, and it looks like there isn't a problem on here. Okay, no problem. A versus D. The climate of the Arctic ecosystem changes, and the distribution of penguin species changes as well. Ooh, that is a good one. The climate, my only thing I could think about that is climate is long-term effects versus this one, part A, due to global, that's climate as well. This may not have been a really well-developed question. I apologize for that. Hopefully, if nothing else, it was good just to go back and look at the charts, make sure you can understand those. But I do agree, that's kind of a iffy question. That's really all that I had for this presentation. If we have students out there, I do want you to know I wish you the best of luck on the upcoming AP Bio exam. This is definitely a weird year. I encourage you to do your best. You're already resilient in what you're doing right now, and being the first group ever to do it in this format. Get a good night of rest. Hopefully you're reviewing with your teachers in the meantime, and I hope this has been helpful. Have a good day and good luck on the test.